I'm Teisha Bader with our continuing coverage of the situation in Israel and a look at things from the United States, including with Jewish leaders and organizations. This week, a B'nai B'rith international delegation met with United Nations Secretary General Antonio Gutteres at UN headquarters about the situation. And we are so fortunate to have David Michaels, who is B'nai B'rith's Director of UN and Intercommunal Affairs, joining us here to speak about that meeting and beyond. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Teisha, for having me.
So tell us about this meeting with Antonio Gutteres. What was the tone? What was the atmosphere like? And what was said?
Well, we've met with Secretary General Gutteres on a number of occasions. Needless to say, we were deeply appreciative to have the opportunity to meet with him again, especially at a time like this. We underscored to him both the very real, practical, and moral stakes of this moment, of the need for absolute clarity on the depravity of Israel's enemies that we've seen over the past week, the complete lack of equivalence between a country fighting to defend itself and to terrorists looking to destroy that country. And we made clear that Israel's right, but also its fundamental obligation, is to do everything possible to ensure the survival of its citizens and of the state itself. And frankly, the international community has responsibilities here. It has an obligation to repudiate and to neutralize the threat and to help free that mind-boggling number of innocent Israeli, but also international hostages being subjected to barbarism that we can only imagine.
What did you hear from the Secretary General about what you just said, and in particular about the hostage situation?
Well, we've heard a number of expressions, both public and private, from the Secretary General and other UN officials condemning the attacks on Israelis as we would expect. I don't want to get too much into detail on private conversations, but I will say this. In a number of our meetings over the course of years now, Secretary General Gutteres, who, as you may know, is a former Prime Minister of Portugal, has spoken emotionally and personally about the injustice of the Inquisition in an expulsion of Jews from Portugal and the rest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th and 16th centuries. We appreciate any expression of support for the fight against anti-Semitism, including, of course, anti-Israel fanaticism, both public and private. But we expect the UN system and its leaders to finally treat anti-Israel terrorists in the way that it would treat terrorists targeting any other people. Personally, I emphasized to Secretary General Gutteres that Israeli governments, both center-left and center-right, had completely and unilaterally withdrawn 23 and 18 years ago from the Gaza Strip and also from the former security zone in southern Lebanon. They also repeatedly offered the Palestinian Authority practically everything that it's claimed to seek in final status negotiations. But as we know, the Israelis have received in return only more and more grave violence and existential threats from proxies of a regime of Iran, openly sworn to Israel's destruction and racing as we speak to a nuclear weapons capability. So in our view, it's substantially past time to move beyond words and to stop blaming Israel for civilian suffering and to recognize those who are so determined to prevent peace. Certainly, I think all of us are concerned that as this chapter moves forward, we may be hearing more and more, maybe seeing more and more attempts at a fake balance within the international community and more pressure on Israel to restrain critical defensive operations. And so in continuing to communicate with the Secretary General and with UN officials, we're going to ensure that the solidarity and the sympathy that was expressed to us in that meeting, and that's been expressed in other settings, will continue until the fundamental problem is addressed in a more systemic way.
Do you feel, as far as what the UN has said publicly about what happened in Israel, about this brutal massacre by Hamas, do you feel that that is sufficient, or were you hoping that there was more that could have been said in as far as a public statement by the UN?
More is absolutely needed. I have to say, from the very first day or two of this new chapter in our lives, we've seen a degree again of, to use that same word, of restraint, again, of balance by international officials that would not be applied in the case of terrorist attacks in France or in the UK, in Belgium, in
anywhere else,
States, or elsewhere.
Anywhere else. Yep.
And so it hasn't been enough. And frankly, some of the sympathy and understanding expressed in different settings privately needs to be as full-throated publicly. It needs to be acknowledged once and for all that Israel is not the problem, that Israel has tried everything possible through bilateral efforts, through unilateral efforts to reach peace with all of its neighbors. Israel has, in fact, established peace eagerly with every single willing Arab and Muslim partner, from Egypt and Jordan, more recently, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and others. And Israel would be the first to want to finally reach a true and lasting peace with the Palestinians. That said, in light of the open doctrinal commitments, the open fanatic ideology of Iran and its proxies, including Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as Islamic Jihad, from the time of the Oslo Accords, we just marked the 30th anniversary of the signing of Oslo last month, hard as that is to believe. Hamas was committed through suicide bombings, as I'm sure you remember well, in the mid-90s, to prevent any progress, not only for Israelis, but for Palestinians themselves. It's as clear as day that the agenda of Hamas, its partners, and its sponsors is to prevent reconciliation, even if that's at the cost of the very lives, not only of Israelis, but of the Palestinians themselves. And a moral equivalence will only serve ultimately to hurt not just Israelis, but also Palestinians.
Yeah, I want to talk more about this moral equivalence because we see it on social media. We're seeing it on college campuses. We're seeing people, it boggles the mind to understand people who are trying to come at the situation as, well, they did this, so we did that, or to make any sort of an equation here when it is so blatantly a black and white event. This was a massacre, a slaughter, full stop. Any kind of context or but or how about this is just completely irrelevant. And I'm just wondering how B'nai B'rith, how you try and sort of deal with these types of the rhetoric that we're hearing and the things that people are writing and saying on social media and beyond.
Yesterday we had an event with the U.S. and Israeli ambassadors to the United Nations. We marked at the Consulate General of Germany the 180th anniversary of our own organization, of B'nai B'rith's founding here in New York, as really a pioneer of global humanitarianism by German Jewish immigrants. So here we were across from the United Nations headquarters, itself established in the wake of the Holocaust to prevent future genocides, 90 years after Hitler's rise to power in Germany, and 30 years after Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres had done everything possible to make peace with the Palestinians then led by Yasser Arafat. On your point on the moral equivalence, in World War II, and I think we need to be, generally speaking, incredibly careful with historical parallels and historical analogies. But to take World War II, civilians suffered immeasurably on all sides of that horrific 6-year conflict. But no one, and critically by no one, I include modern day reformed Germany would dare to suggest any moral equivalence between Nazi Germany and the Allies. There's no doubt. It's tragic and it's true that Israelis and Palestinians alike, and I'd add countless other Arabs and Muslims ready and eager to have peace and partnership with Israel in their own self-interest. It's tragic that Israelis and Palestinians alike are held hostage to the region's worst fanatics. But the one thing, and I and my leadership made this very, very clear to the Secretary General and to many of our other interlocutors over the course of this week, the one thing that clearly will not improve the current situation over the long term is to advertise, to publicly and repeatedly tell the terrorists, whether within the United Nations or otherwise, that they cannot and will not legitimately be targeted for crimes against humanity if they only use civilians as human shields. We're giving them a recipe for continuing the atrocities. We're not only rewarding, but we're incentivizing and guaranteeing more of those atrocities. And so Israel, with the help of all people of conscience, has to change the status quo if the genocidal forces of our time are to finally be stopped. And I'll make one final point. Not a lot of people know this. I mentioned B'nai B'rith, our founding here in New York in 1843. Documents matter. Foundational documents matter. Values matter. Aspirations, stated aspirations matter. They say when someone tells you who they are, if they show you who they are, believe them. Mein Kampf mattered. Hitler had said well before he came to power what he intended to do. The mullahs in Iran are very open about their values and aspirations. If you compare the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel in 1948, or if you look at the charter a century prior for the founding of B'nai B'rith, you see values of pluralism, of coexistence, of seeking peace, of mutual respect. You look at the charter of Hamas, and when some media outlets refer to Hamas as militants, as fighters, in this sanitized way, folks would be shocked. Even today, educated people would be shocked to look at the charter and to see the Hamas charter engaging explicitly in the most classic anti-Semitic canards and genocidal aspirations that one can imagine, including pointing to B'nai B'rith specifically as part of what they see as a global Jewish conspiracy. So in terms of what we can do, and I think perhaps if we have a bit more time, we can talk about it, the leadership of President Biden and all leaders of influence in the world really will be critical, and international solidarity will be critical to help Israel and to help good Palestinians to finally rid themselves of this menace, the likes of which we saw this past week in the most dramatic way.
Yeah, it is shocking, David, that there are people who come on to speak on various media outlets and just will not condemn Hamas, will not call them terrorists. It is just something that it does not compute. And I know there's probably not a lot you can say about this, but as far as the citizens of Israel that are being held hostage, and as you mentioned, among them U.S. citizens and citizens of other countries, in theory, would there be any role that the United Nations could play if they chose to? What are if you can just touch on that for a moment?
Sure.
In the return, obviously, in the safe return, or at least in having some contact or perhaps getting some information.
Well, no, it's obviously a critical question. If there's one thing that the United Nations has at its disposal, it's an international network. You have 193 member states of the United Nations. Those member states include Iran. They include Lebanon, where Hezbollah is dominant. They include allies and sponsors and supporters of Hamas, but they also include all of the world's major democracies. And so the United Nations, its human rights apparatus, and its leadership does, we would think, and in many cases, I think in reality, does have access to parties to this current emergency situation. And so I think it's clear that elements within the United Nations are looking to contribute to ensuring or doing everything possible to ensure that the situation doesn't become worse, doesn't expand beyond Hamas to Israel's north, although we've seen that off and on throughout the week, let alone over the course of many years, and to other fronts. And certainly, we believe and we hope that the United Nations is making efforts to intervene on behalf of the hostages and to call and work for their unconditional release. The question is whether the United Nations is going to prioritize that, is going to be effective. But again, going back to our original point, on prioritizing it, the moral credibility of the United Nations can't be compromised by making equivalence between the two sides here. If, unfortunately, over the course of the progression of the current moment, we see an increase in the number of Palestinian casualties, including inevitably because of how Hamas and other terrorists have positioned themselves deliberately in the Gaza Strip. We see a growing number of casualties among non-combatants. The fear and the experience would tell us, and the politics of the United Nations would have us worry that there's going to be more and more of an emphasis of pressure on Israel rather than on pressure on those who sparked the current crisis and those who continue to hold as many as 150 innocent people in unknown locations. So we're told that efforts are being made. We hope those efforts are going to be successful. And certainly we insist that the release of the hostages be both immediate and unconditional. This is not a negotiation. We cannot reward atrocities and crimes against humanity, the likes of which we've seen the last week. There is no equivalence between terrorists who went through judicial processes in Israeli prisons and Holocaust survivors, mothers, children, and toddlers being held underground in tunnels and other facilities across the Gaza Strip.
It is unconscionable, and it goes without saying, but we will say it here in any case, that clearly Hamas is responsible for the civilians of Gaza, and that there would not be airstrikes and civilian casualties in Gaza were it not for Hamas's deliberate, brutal attack on Israel on Saturday. Switching gears just for a moment, I know you yourself were not there, but there was a meeting held this week at the White House with President Biden, who has been very strong on the U.S. position about Israel. But I know that I believe Dan Mariashin was there for B'nai B'rith. If you can just give us a sense of what was his experience sitting down with other Jewish leaders, hearing from the administration in this setting, which is so important.
Yeah, well, I think the meeting that you're referring to at the White House, it fell on the same day in Washington as our meeting here in New York with the UN Secretary General. Dan Mariashin was here with me in New York. Our colleague, Rabbi Eric Fussfield, was in Washington for that meeting to take part in ongoing discussions on the national anti-Semitism strategy in particular. And the president really was good enough to take the time to join this meeting and to address both the administration's ongoing commitment to the fight against anti-Semitism and more immediately this week, its leadership on the issue of the current crisis in our ally, Israel. That meeting on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, followed by one day, one of the most important and powerful statements of principle, certainly that I've heard in my lifetime, but I think in many of our lifetimes, by the President of the United States on this harrowing situation and this moral crisis of the highest magnitude. At the meeting at the White House with representatives of Jewish organizations, President Biden again displayed, not only in words, but really in ways I'm told that can't quite, that go beyond the vocabulary that he used and the content of his remarks. He really displayed how viscerally he feels, as one would expect any feeling and thinking human being to feel,
yes,
in response to the atrocities we've seen over the past week. I think all of us, despite our best efforts, I can speak for myself, have been exposed to reports and sometimes to images and material that none of us should ever have to see or encounter any time in our lives. And, I don't want to get too specific or too graphic here. But I think, unfortunately, we've been forced, both internally and in our messaging and communication with the outside world and the international community, we've been forced to be much more open and much more forthright about just how horrific the events of the past week have seen. And so President Biden at that meeting spoke about the decapitation of infants, something that might be associated with ISIS, but in some ways we've seen things that, some of the worst elements in human history probably wouldn't be associated with. So his leadership, the leadership of so many who have rallied around Israel, at the very least in the first days of this crisis, is critical. And I think every signal is that it will continue as it must. I would say one more thing. As you know, we've lived over many months and years now in polarizing and hyper partisan times. And for me, as a Jew and as an American, to see yet again an overwhelming bipartisan rallying around Israel in principle, and as Americans who have an obligation to our most important ally and partner in the Middle East, a fellow democracy, the only democracy in its region, but also as a country whose interests are so fundamentally intertwined with preserving some type of moral code, some type of order in the world. This has been not only encouraging to me in the face of all of the brutality and all of the sadness and all of the fear, but it's also been quite inspiring. And we hope, with all of the divisiveness, with all of the noise, with all of the false accusations and equivalency directed at Israel and the most moral army by far in the Middle East, if not the world, we're going to have to work to ensure that solidarity and that moral clarity on a broad basis continues as Israel continues to try to meet this challenge.
Absolutely, David. Thank you so much for taking the time. David Michaels is B'nai B'rith's Director of UN and Intercommunal Affairs. We thank him so much for joining us here on JBS.
Thank you.